Hey there, CRYPTID'S family. Today feels like the perfect time to share a story that Charlotte Charlie has held close to her heart for years. It's about her grandmother, a woman of incredible strength and quiet wisdom. One unforgettable encounter deep in the forest left a mark on Charlie's life. And now, she's finally ready to pass that memory along to you, just as it was once passed to her. Now, let's get into it. Have you ever heard a voice in the woods, even when no one else was there? It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even a cry. It was something far older, like a mother calling through time, mourning a child no one remembers. Most people think stories like this are just folklore, but on the night Charlotte Hammond returned to her family's long-abandoned cabin in the Montana hills, divorced, unemployed, and 56 years old, she saw the one thing she never believed was real. A woman, standing at the tree line, holding a child her grandmother had whispered about her for years. She wasn't a monster, she'd say. She was a mother. I've spent the last 3 years documenting stories like this. Memories people bury because no one believes them. But this one never let me go. In the next few minutes, you'll uncover why children vanish in these woods and are never found. Who walks the pines when the frost sets in? And what might happen if she decides to walk toward you? Charlotte still remembers the footprints in the frost, the eyes watching her from the dark, and the lantern light, barely enough to keep the woman away. If you skip this video, you'll keep telling yourself it's just a story. But at 5 minutes from now, you won't see the forest the same way again. Charlotte Hammond never planned on returning to that cabin. Not really. It had lived too long in the corners of her memory. Dusty, distant, warped like heat rising off summer asphalt. It was the kind of place you leave in your past, like a childhood bruise or the sound of your mother crying behind a closed door. But there she was, pulling off the gravel road onto the old dirt path, tires crunching slowly through the pine needles, headlights slicing through a fog too thick for morning. It was October, and Montana had already gone cold. She sat behind the wheel for nearly 5 minutes before stepping out. There were no neighbors here, no cell service, just a thin crackle of wind brushing against the timber frame and the far-off yawn of the Bitterroot Mountains. And behind it all, quiet. That kind of silence that wasn't just about sound but weight, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The cabin stood like a ghost, tilted, weary, half swallowed by undergrowth. She felt suddenly like an intruder. The boards creaked beneath her boots as she walked up to the porch, and for a second she expected the door to swing open on its own, just like it did when she was 6, when her grandmother still sat in that green rocker with a cup of tea and a voice low enough to call the dead. Eleanor Hammond had never been the kind of woman who told stories just to pass time. Every word she spoke carried the gravity of memory, as though she were unearthing something sacred with each syllable. And her favorite story, the one Charlotte used to laugh at behind cupped hands, always began the same way. It wasn't an animal. She looked right into me. It came back to her in waves now. Those evenings on the porch, the smell of pine tar and tobacco, the sound of the screen door slamming shut with a sigh. Charlotte would be half listening, half believing, pretending to read while Eleanor recounted the same tale over and over, never changing a detail. The fall of 1905. A walk north of the ridge. The forest that had gone suddenly terribly still. Charlotte could still hear the cadence of her voice, the way it softened when she reached that part. The creek bebbed, the hush, and then the figure, towering, covered in reddish-brown hair, not stumbling through the trees but crouched, like a woman at a gravesite. Eleanor had said she froze, not out of fear, but awe. The thing wasn't alone. There was a smaller shape beside her, a child, maybe 3 feet tall, with pale fur and wide, dark eyes. Charlotte never forgot the way her grandmother described those eyes. Old eyes, she'd say, like she'd seen too much. Back then, Charlotte figured it was just mountain loneliness talking. A grief story, born from loss and too many winters alone. Eleanor had buried 2 children before Charlotte's father was even born. Maybe she needed to believe that something, anything, was still watching over the woods, still walking its edges like a guardian. Maybe Bigfoot was just the shape that loneliness took when you needed it most. But then came the day Charlotte found the journal. It was hidden behind the hearthstone, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a leather strap stained darker than the rest. Maybe blood, maybe sap. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. Tight cursive, sharp corners, every word pressed into the page like a confession. The entry was dated October 3rd, 1905. Charlotte read the first sentence out loud. She watched me before I ever saw her. That was the moment something shifted. Not just in her understanding of the story, but in her bones. It was as if the memory had been sleeping inside the walls all this time, waiting for her to come back, to remember. Then the forest began to change. It started with the animals. Birds that stopped singing. Squirrels that wouldn't approach the feeders. The usual rustle and click of life seemed to dim around the cabin, replaced by something too even, too calm. Charlotte began to wake at odd hours, heart pounding, unsure why. Once she swore she heard wood tapping, slow, deliberate, somewhere beyond the tree line. Another night, a sound like a low moan curled through the mist. Not close, but not far enough. And then came the footprints. They weren't there in the evening, but by morning, just beyond the porch. Huge. 5-toed impressions pressed deep into the mud, perfectly formed, moving in a slow arc around the cabin, like a sentry on patrol. And beside them, smaller prints, child-sized, precise, matching stride for stride. She didn't tell anyone, not at first. Who would believe her? Even she barely believed it. Until one night, in the fog-thick dark, she saw them. She saw them. 2 silhouettes, one tall, one small, standing motionless between the trees, watching. Charlotte didn't run. She didn't scream. She did the only thing that made sense. She stepped forward, but they were gone before her foot touched the ground. She spent the rest of the night by the fire, clutching her grandmother's journal like a relic. In the flickering lamplight, her eyes traced every line Eleanor had written, about the silence, about the child, about the moment she understood she was not alone. And then there it was, one last line scrawled in ink that trembled slightly more than the rest. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was grieving. That one sentence hollowed Charlotte out because it meant Eleanor hadn't been telling a story. She'd been telling the truth. She'd carried that truth for over 50 years, whispered it into ears, that now Charlotte had seen them too. And suddenly the stories didn't feel like folklore. They felt like warnings, like invitations, like legacy. And there was something else buried beneath the fear. A strange, fragile connection. One woman to another. One mother to another. And just like that, the past had teeth again. The forest was awake. And Charlotte was no longer alone. Eleanor was 20 years old the first time she saw the creature, and she'd never forget the way the air felt just before it appeared. Too still, like something sacred was about to cross her path. It was early fall, 1905, and she had wandered farther than usual from the family homestead, her canvas-gathering satchel heavy with choke cherries and pine tips. The North Ridge was quiet that day, unusually so, and the sun hung low despite it being only afternoon, casting pale light through the thinning canopy of western larch and fir. She had smelled the dry bite of autumn in the wind, but the wind had stopped. Even the birds had gone mute. Her family lived hard on the edge of civilization, in a lean-to shack stitched from hand-split logs and stubborn faith. Eleanor's father, Thomas, had been a trapper since he was 12. He taught her how to read deer scat like letters on a page, how to tell direction from the moss, and how to find her way back by following the wind. Her mother, Marie, part Mi'kmaq and part Missouri settler, was a healer, known for her bitter teas and salves made of bear grease and thistle. People rode 3 days just to get stitched up by her or to fetch her ginseng paste for snakebite. Eleanor grew up in the shadow of both their worlds. One carved from the flesh of the land, the other whispered from its spirit. She didn't think of any of that as she knelt beside a root cluster. Fingers dirt-streaked, slipping ginger root into the satchel. Her thoughts were half on the berries in her pocket and half on the cold stew waiting back at camp. Then it happened. One of those strange moments that doesn't announce itself with sound, but with its absence. No bird calls, no insects. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. And then she heard it. A sound not made by wind or beast. A low, mournful hum. Deep and oddly melodic. Like a lullaby sung by someone with a broken heart. Eleanor froze, her hands in the dirt, breath stuck halfway between her ribs and her throat. For a second she thought it might be a woman. Hurt maybe, lost. But there was no urgency to it. No panic. Just sadness. She stood slowly, brushing earth from her skirts, eyes scanning the thickets ahead. The noise came again, lower this time, closer. She stepped forward. Each step was deliberate, the way her father taught her, to move like you were already part of the woods. Her boots barely stirred the soil. She crested a small rise and saw the creek bed glinting in the filtered light, barely more than a trickle over stone. And there, beside it, she saw her. The figure crouched low, half in shadow. At first, Eleanor thought it was a bear, but no bear ever held itself like that. The posture was wrong. Upright, yet not rigid, calm, watchful. Then the figure turned, and Eleanor's knees almost gave way. She was massive, easily 7 feet tall, her body covered in thick auburn fur that shimmered with faint red when the sun touched it. But it was her face that stopped Eleanor cold. Not monstrous, not beastly, but unmistakably human. Not in shape, but in expression. The eyes, old, wise, exhausted. The kind of eyes you only saw in widows and wolves. Next to her, almost hidden behind one leg, was a smaller form. Thin-limbed, bright-eyed, shivering slightly as if sensing the attention. A child, covered in paler fur, more cream than auburn. Its gaze locked onto Eleanor's like it had been expecting her. That's when Eleanor did something she never understood, even later. She didn't run, didn't scream. She lowered her eyes, just slightly, and took a slow step back, like one might do when stumbling upon a deer and its fawn. She didn't want to be a threat. She didn't want to break the spell. But the spell broke anyway. The tall figure stood, smooth and controlled. And even in that movement, Eleanor could feel the raw power under her skin. But there was no aggression, no teeth, no howl. Just an endless, impossible sadness. And then the woman made a sound, a soft, rumbling exhale, half song, half sigh. Eleanor later described it as the sound a mountain might make if it could grieve. Then they turned and vanished into the trees. No crash of branches, no stomping through brush, just gone. Hooked into that silence was a revelation Eleanor would carry for the rest of her life. That what she had seen was not a monster. It was a mother. Not a predator, but a protector. And in that shared glance, Eleanor had seen something she could never unsee. For years afterward, she returned to that creek bed. Left offerings, berries, root bundles, once even a carved figurine made from soft pine. Not every time, but often enough. And each time she felt watched, but never threatened. She never told anyone, not at first, not her mother, not even her father, but she began writing it down. At night, by oil lamp, on the back pages of her mother's herb journals. She called her the woman in the fog. She described her in meticulous detail. Height, hair texture, eye shape. But it was the emotions that always came back the same. She was guarding something, Eleanor wrote. Not from me, from the world. Years later, she would tell her granddaughter that same story, over and over, never changing a word. And Charlotte would laugh, thinking it was just one of those backwoods fairy tales spun by women with too many cold nights and not enough company. But what Charlotte never realized, until much later, was that Eleanor wasn't telling her a story. She was giving her a warning, a key, a truth. One that would only make sense the day she saw those same eyes shining out from the trees beyond her porch. And the forest would remember. Charlotte remembered the creak of the old porch swing before she remembered her grandmother's face. Funny how sound lingers longer than sight. That rhythmic groan of wood on rusted chains had scored her childhood summers like a heartbeat, slow and steady, always just outside the screen door. Eleanor Hammond never raised her voice when she told stories. She didn't have to. There was a weight to her words that did the shouting for her. And when she leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes narrowed toward the tree line, the air around her shifted, like the forest itself leaned in to listen. To a child of the 70s, Bigfoot was a joke, something from comic books or blurry home videos played on late-night TV. Charlotte would sit cross-legged on the porch, half listening, a cherry popsicle melting down her arm while her cousins rolled their eyes behind her. But Eleanor never cracked a smile when she spoke of the creature. Not once. That was what made it stick. She wasn't wild, her grandmother would say, tapping her teacup with one thick-knuckled finger. She was wise, sad, like she knew the world had turned its back on her. Then she'd nod toward the trees, where the light always seemed to die too early, and add, "They only come through here when they trust the land, when they know they're safe." Charlotte would laugh then, because that's what children do when things feel too big to believe. But even then, something in her felt the tremor of it, like touching the edge of a live wire. She never forgot the look in her grandmother's eyes when she said those words. It wasn't wonder. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. As she grew older, Eleanor's stories faded into the same drawer where she kept old photographs and her father's war medals. Things you acknowledge, but never really unpack. Charlotte moved on, built a life in Missoula, taught middle school history, married a man who liked numbers more than people. By the time Eleanor passed in 1996, Charlotte had come to think of the cabin and the forest around it as something like folklore, real enough to visit but not to live inside. But grief has a way of pulling you backward. By 2011, Charlotte was alone. The school board had downsized. Her marriage had been held together by silence for years, and finally fell apart with a single sentence. "I think we want different things." Her daughter, Lucy, had moved to Portland and stopped calling. And so, with nothing left to keep her in town, Charlotte loaded her station wagon with tools, dry goods, and Eleanor's worn quilt, and drove north. The cabin had aged in her absence. The moss on the roof was thicker, the screen door hung lower, and the pine needles on the porch had turned gray with time. But it was still theirs, still hers. Inside, the floorboards creaked like an old man's joints, and the air smelled of cedar, dust, and something deeper, something like memory. She spent the first few days in silence, patching leaks, stacking wood, boiling coffee over the fire like Eleanor used to. For the first time in years, her thoughts began to settle. She started rereading Eleanor's notebooks, pages filled with remedies, observations, and small sketches of the forest. Tucked between 2 pages on mullein tinctures, she found a folded sheet of paper she'd never seen before. On it, a single sentence in Eleanor's hand. She had a child with her. That was the first time Charlotte felt it again. That same electric shiver from childhood, the one that made your breath catch and your gut tighten, as if the trees outside the window were suddenly watching you back. And then came the knocking. It started just past midnight. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, echoing through the cold walls like bones against bark. Charlotte sat up in bed, heart thrashing, the quilt bunched in her fists. She told herself it was a tree limb, maybe a loose shutter. But then it came again. Same pattern, same rhythm, only this time closer. She got out of bed, slipped her boots on without socks, and grabbed a lantern from the hook by the stove. The light stuttered but held. She stepped outside. The woods were pale with fog, and the silence was thick enough to drink. No owls, no wind, no moon. And then she saw them, 2 shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the lantern light. One tall, unmoving, the other smaller, pressed close to the first. They did not flinch, did not blink. They simply watched. Charlotte didn't breathe, couldn't. Her mind raced, screaming for logic, for explanation. But her body, her bones, remembered something else. Her grandmother's voice, soft and firm. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was grieving. A few minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. The figures turned, melted back into the trees like smoke, and were gone. The next morning, Charlotte found the footprints. Huge, 5-toed impressions in the dew-damp earth, circling the cabin once, deliberate, protective. And beside them, smaller prints, childlike, mirroring each step. Charlotte knelt beside them, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch one. The soil was still cool, still fresh. She whispered, "I believe you, Grandma," and the wind stirred the trees like an answer. That night she sat on the porch swing again, wrapped in Eleanor's quilt, staring into the same woods her grandmother once faced. The chain groaned beneath her weight, same as it always had. Somewhere, far off, a low hum threaded through the trees, ancient, aching, and familiar. And in that moment, Charlotte knew this was not a story that ended with Eleanor. This was a story that had waited, patiently, for someone to come home. Charlotte thought she'd come to the cabin to heal, to forget, to let time do its slow, cruel magic of turning sharp pain into dull background noise. She'd packed her bags not out of bravery but exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your marrow after too many goodbyes and too few reasons to stay. Missoula had offered her nothing but layoff letters and empty chairs. Her husband, now a ghost she passed in divorce court, had moved on before the ink dried, and her daughter, Lucy, hadn't answered the last 3 voicemails. The cabin wasn't salvation. It was surrender. But in those first quiet days back, there was a strange peace in the repetition of survival. She patched the roof with fresh tar, swept dead pine needles from the porch, chopped wood until her hands blistered. At night, she lit the lantern like Eleanor used to, sat in her grandmother's old rocker and stared into the black wall of trees. It was comforting in a way to feel so small again, so forgotten. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a sound at first, but a feeling, a weight pressing in around the cabin. Like the forest had shifted its gaze and suddenly realized something had returned. Something familiar. On the 3rd night, Charlotte awoke to the smell of smoke. But there was no fire. Just a scent drifting through the cracks of the old log walls, sharp and earthy. Burnt sage. Something Eleanor used to burn during storms. She almost laughed at the memory. Almost. A few minutes later, something knocked. 3 times. Soft, slow, not frantic. Not wind, not accident. Intentional. She held her breath, eyes locked on the dark line of the door, too afraid to move. Nothing followed. No voice. No footsteps. Just silence. When morning came, she opened the door with a hammer in one hand, ready to swing. But the porch was empty. No sign of visitors, except footprints. She saw them at first as smudges, then shapes. 5-toed, wide-set, almost human but too long, too broad. Not bear, not boot. Something in between. They circled the cabin once. Just once, then vanished into the pine grove like a whispered thought. Charlotte followed them for maybe 10 yards before they disappeared into frozen leaves and moss. That night, she didn't sleep. The second knock came 2 nights later. Same rhythm. Same pause after. This time, She stood and walked straight to the door, heart pounding. She opened it fast, sudden, like pulling off a bandage. But again, nothing, except fog, heavy and low, curling around the porch like a sleeping animal. And then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, she saw movement. She didn't breathe, didn't blink. A figure, tall, still, watching. Charlotte stepped forward slowly, raising her lantern. The fog wavered, light bouncing off the mist. The figure didn't flinch. It stood rooted, part shadow, part flesh. And beside it, smaller, shorter. A taller one shifted, head tilting like it recognized her. Like it had been waiting. She wanted to speak, but her throat caught on something unspoken, too deep for words. Then, as if by cue, the tall one stepped back, not out of fear, out of decision. And together they melted into the trees. She spent the next day in a haze, rereading Eleanor's old journal like it might suddenly rearrange itself into an answer. And then, near the back, scrawled in rough pencil, a line she'd somehow missed. Returned last night. Same song. Same sorrow. Same sorrow. Still not alone. Charlotte shut the book. That night, she left something on the porch. Berries, wrapped in a handkerchief. A small act. A peace offering. A test. The next morning, the berries were gone. The cloth left neatly folded. That wasn't the part that chilled her blood. Near the base of the old oak by the cabin, scratched into the bark, high above her head, was a mark. A long, vertical gouge, deeper than any knife, as if made by a claw or a rock or something stronger than either. And below it, in smaller lines, a circle. Inside the circle, 2 dots, eyes, watching. That night, the knocking didn't come, but something else did. A voice, soft. Not language, but cadence, like singing underwater, like lullabies echoing down a long tunnel. She sat upright in bed, heart stuttering, the lamp flickering beside her. The voice rose, then fell, then rose again. Not far. Not close. Just enough to remind her, you are not alone. The next morning, the wind returned. Birds came back. The silence lifted. But something inside Charlotte had shifted. She began to walk farther from the cabin. She found small things left along the path. Twigs braided together, stones stacked in perfect balance, feathers nestled into tree hollows, like signposts, or gifts, or warnings. Then she found the deer. It was behind the woodshed. Bones only. Clean. Arranged. No blood. No drag marks. Just the rib cage, splayed like an open book. And in the center, a stone, smooth. Painted red. Charlotte didn't touch it. She didn't go near the woodshed after that. But she started locking the door again. That night, the forest held its breath, and somewhere, beyond the edge of sleep, she heard Eleanor's voice. Not memory, not dream. Just 4 words, wrapped in wind. They remember you now, and Charlotte knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't just watching. There's something ancient about silence in the woods. Not the kind you find during a morning walk or a snowfall, but the thick, heavy kind that presses against your ears and gut until you're sure the trees themselves are holding something back. Charlotte had come to fear that silence, not because it meant something was there, but because it meant something was listening. After the second week, her sleep had thinned to fragments. The knocking didn't return, but the woods made sure she remembered. At dusk, shadows grew too long. At dawn, the birds hesitated, as if unsure it was safe to sing. Her offerings, small stones, cedar sprigs, bits of dried meat, were always taken, always with care, never scattered, never wasted, as though someone or something was trying to communicate. She began to dig deeper into Eleanor's notebooks, not just the ones about herbs and remedies, but the ones hidden under floorboards and tucked into lining seams of old coats. That's where the stories lived. The warnings. The Kutenai spoke of Skanita, the tall ones, spirits of the forest that protected or punished, depending on the respect shown. The Blackfeet had tales of the Apakwis, figures who walked between realms, mothers of the wild, guardians of lost children. These weren't Bigfoot stories meant for tourists. These were sacred, quiet truths, not meant to be told loudly, but whispered to those who knew how to listen. In one crumbling entry, Eleanor had written, "Not a beast, not a ghost, something older. Something that remembers what we forget." Charlotte took that line and underlined it 3 times, because she finally understood what her grandmother had been trying to say, not just through her words, but through how she lived. Through the reverence in her silence, through the way she faced the trees as if expecting to be seen back. Then came the article. Old, yellowed, folded into the back of a ledger. Missoula Sentinel, October 1906. Headline: Trapper claims to hear singing in the hills. Reports strange prints, vanishing game. Charlotte read it twice, then 3 more times. A trapper named Isaac Dar claimed he followed a soft humming into the trees one night and saw a woman of great size, covered in red hair, sitting beside a stillborn elk. The article mocked him, called it whiskey talk, but his description, it matched Eleanor's down to the tilt of the creature's head, the way it never bared its teeth. Charlotte traced the ink with her fingertip, shivering. These stories weren't scattered myths. They were a map, a hidden language, left by those willing to risk ridicule to speak the truth. She drove to the local library in the nearest town, hoping for more. In the microfilm archives, she found clippings, more than she expected. Reports of missing livestock, children who wandered and were found miles away, unharmed but silent, with no memory of where they'd been. One child in 1972 claimed, "A big lady held me under the trees so I wouldn't be cold." The parents said it was imagination. The doctors blamed trauma, but Charlotte knew better, because the details were always the same. The singing, the smell of cedar, the deep-set eyes that watched but never chased. Guardians, not monsters. Mourning figures in a world that no longer knew how to mourn. Then came the real break. A taped interview, buried in a dusty anthropology thesis from the 1980s, between a researcher and elderly Salish woman named Ruth Swan. Ruth spoke slowly, in English roughened by time, and said, "They walk when their dead are near. When their young are sick. They stay quiet unless the forest is out of balance." Charlotte played that clip 4 times. On the 5th, she sat frozen as Ruth said one more thing. "But sometimes, they leave gifts too, for those who remember." And suddenly, Charlotte remembered the stone. The one she'd found inside the rib cage of the deer, smooth, painted red. She had buried it near the oak, too frightened to keep it close. But now, she rushed out with a flashlight, kneeling in the moss and dirt, clawing at the ground until her nails cracked. And when she found it again, when her fingers closed around its polished surface, she felt something move. Not around her, but inside her, like an echo awakening. It wasn't paint. It was ochre, the kind her grandmother used to mark blessings on the door during storms. She brought the stone inside and placed it beside Eleanor's photo. That night, the woods were still. That silence returned, but different. Not hollow, not ominous, like someone had laid a blanket over the land. She lit the fire and read aloud from Eleanor's journal, just one entry. And when she finished, the wind outside rose. Not a gust, but a breath. Long, even. Like someone exhaling through the trees. It was the first time Charlotte didn't feel alone. But she also knew the story wasn't over. Because silence in the forest wasn't always peace. Sometimes it was a gathering, a preparation. And whatever was waiting, it wasn't finished with her yet. The news reached Charlotte through an old ham radio transmission crackling out of the cabin's storage chest. Something she'd found on a shelf behind a broken jar of pickled carrots. The radio, dusty and half dead, coughed out static and half sentences until one night it found the signal. The voice on the other end was distant, low, and indifferent to time. Montana Search and Rescue. Report closure on comet case. Boy found. Safe. No sign of injuries. Claims of forest guardian unsubstantiated. Charlotte froze. She rewound the tape. Played it again. Slower. Like each syllable was a bone from an old skeleton she hadn't expected to find. Comet. Boy. Forest guardian. Isaac Moore had been 9 when he vanished. The year was 2003. He'd wandered away from a campsite during a family gathering near Lake Comet, just 60 miles south of Charlotte's cabin. The park rangers searched for days. Dogs, choppers, volunteers blanketing the woods. They found nothing. Then, 14 days later, he was there, standing on the trail, barefoot, clothes dirty but intact, arms scratched but eyes calm. He didn't cry. He didn't run to his parents. He just stood still, blinking against the morning light like someone waking from a long sleep. At the hospital, he said he'd been taken care of. She covered me when it rained, he told the nurse. She brought me food, berries, meat. She hummed to me at night so I wouldn't be afraid. They asked if it was a woman from another camp. He shook his head. She was tall, hair everywhere. Her eyes were like grandmas. The nurse had written that last part in parentheses, a note of disbelief. Charlotte pulled the news clipping from a box she'd forgotten she had. The photo of the boy showed him holding a juice box, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the camera like he didn't quite trust it. His eyes were too old, too knowing. The official report said exposure, temporary disorientation, no sign of abduction. Charlotte knew better. She remembered the footprint beside the old oak, the stone in the deer's ribcage, the lullaby sung in no language. It wasn't a coincidence. Not anymore. She reached for Eleanor's journal, flipped back to the October 1905 entry. There was one line she hadn't understood before. She mourns when the small ones vanish, when we forget to look for. That night, Charlotte stood on the porch, her lantern light trembling with the wind. She whispered into the dark, "Did you bring him home?" Nothing answered. Not directly, but in the woods, something shifted. Not movement, not noise, just awareness. A few days later, she drove to Comet. The ranger station still stood, peeling paint, overgrown gravel drive. She spoke to a volunteer named Glenn, now retired, who had helped on the original search. "We thought we'd lost him," Glenn said, shaking his head. "I've been doing this for 30 years, and that's the first time a kid disappeared without a trace, then came back without a scratch." He paused, glanced toward the woods behind the station. "You know what's strange, though? It snowed 3 times that week, below freezing, but his body temp was normal. No frostbite, no signs of malnutrition. Just tired." Charlotte asked what the boy said. Glenn squinted. He said she called him by his name, that she never spoke loud, that she knew when he was cold before he did. He leaned in closer. He said she wasn't alone, said there was a little one. A kid just like him, but quiet. Watched him, stayed close. Then he said something that made Charlotte's blood drain to her ankles. He said she smelled like his grandmother's quilts. Charlotte didn't speak, couldn't. Glenn just nodded, like he'd said it to others before and gotten the same silence in return. Driving home, Charlotte turned off the radio. The forest outside her window was dark, endless, pulsing with meaning. She wasn't scared anymore, but she was no longer in control. Back at the cabin, she placed her hands on the frame of Eleanor's rocking chair, lowered herself into it slowly, and began to hum. The same hum she remembered from that night. Low, gentle, like a thread between worlds. She didn't expect an answer, but the wind rose anyway, and from somewhere beyond the clearing that sound returned. Not echo, not mimicry, but harmony, and suddenly, Charlotte realized, Isaac wasn't the only one who'd been found. She had been, too. The mind has its own defenses. Charlotte knew this. She taught psychology for 20 years. She understood the language of grief, the mind's ability to bend and reshape memory like water under pressure. But even that logic, that comfort of reason, had started to splinter, because there was a question that kept returning to her every time she looked out into those woods. What if she wasn't just remembering something real? What if something real was remembering her? In the weeks following the discovery of Isaac's story, Charlotte began to write. Not to record, not for legacy, but because her hands needed to do something when her thoughts grew too large. She filled pages with questions, comparisons, sketches. She listed theories like prayers. Was it Bigfoot? A species undiscovered? A relic of Neanderthal lineage hiding in North America's backwoods? Or was it something else entirely? Something not of zoology or anthropology, but of old grief and forgotten truths. She reached out to a retired wildlife biologist, Dr. Elaine Taverner, whose fieldwork in the Pacific Northwest had once been mocked for suggesting non-aggressive large primate behavior patterns in the Olympic forests. Elaine responded with one sentence. If you saw her eyes, then you already know it wasn't about science. Charlotte called her that evening. Their conversation lasted 3 hours. Elaine told her stories of stacked stones in impossible places, of half-buried caches of food left untouched by bears, of patterns, always patterns. Near glacial streams and fog-heavy clearings. The woods are old, she said. They don't need us to believe in them. They need us to listen. Then came the question Charlotte had been avoiding. What if they're not animals? What if they're people? Elaine hesitated. Not like us, she said slowly. But not beasts either. Something in between. Maybe that's the point. They don't fit our categories because they've never belonged to our stories. That night, Charlotte sat by the fire, flipping through Eleanor's final journal. On the last page, her grandmother had written a line, unlike any of the others. The line between spirit and flesh is thinner in grief. That's when they appear, not to harm, but to witness. And suddenly, a thought split her like lightning. What if Eleanor hadn't just seen the creature? What if she had known her? What if they'd come to each other in grief? Two mothers on either side of silence, and found communion in loss. The next morning, Charlotte retraced her steps through the woods to a spot she'd avoided for weeks. The hollow cedar near the creek where she'd seen the figure last. The air there felt heavier, still. She knelt down and placed both palms on the earth, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I understand now." When she opened them, there was something in front of her. Two feathers crossed, a circle of pebbles, and in the center, a single braid of what looked like fur, and a sprig of chokecherry. Not a threat, a message. Not all things that hide are afraid. Some are hiding because they've seen too much. That night, the forest came alive again. But not with fear, with presence. As if every tree, every breath of wind, every distant crack of twig had purpose. Charlotte sat in the rocker, humming quietly, and thought about Eleanor sitting there decades before, facing the same shadows, feeling the same weight. They were myths. They were memory made real. And Charlotte, teacher, skeptic, wanderer, had stepped into something larger than belief. She had stepped into inheritance. And deep in the pines, something watched back, not to haunt, but to remember. Because those who live between the trees do not forget those who once heard their song. And they were not finished singing. The first frost came early that year. Sharp, thin, coating every leaf and rock around the cabin in a brittle shimmer that cracked beneath Charlotte's boots as she made her way through the clearing. She had one thing left to do, one promise to keep. She carried it in the pocket of her coat, smooth, warm from the heat of her hand. a small carving she had worked on every night since that final visit by the oak. A mother and child, whittled from old pine. The wood still smelled faintly of sap. She had no plan, no grand ritual, only this need, this quiet knowing that some stories don't want to be explained. They want to be honored. The trail behind the cabin had always led to the same place. The birch tree, Eleanor's tree. Charlotte had grown up thinking it was just a marker, a place where they had buried her grandmother because the soil was softer there. But now she saw it for what it was, a place chosen. A place where the line between stories and soil thinned. She knelt at the base of the tree, brushing away the frost-covered leaves with care. Her breath clouded before her. The wind was still. For a moment, the whole forest felt like it had paused, listening. She placed the carving gently at the foot of the stone, then whispered, "You were right. Not dramatic, not weeping, just honest." And that made it heavier than anything else. Then she stood and waited. Not for a sign, not for a miracle, just stillness. But the woods, as they had so many times before, answered in their own way. A gust of wind moved through the birch leaves. Low, resonant, like breath. And then, so faint she wasn't sure it was real, she heard it again. That sound. That deep, mournful hum. Not from the trees, not from the wind, but from somewhere beyond both. It moved through her bones, just like Eleanor had said. Just like Eleanor had said. Charlotte turned, and for a moment she thought she saw movement between the trees, a flash of russet and cream. A shape, tall and steady, another, smaller, close beside it. Watching, not hiding. And then they were gone. Like fog pulling back into the mountains. But she wasn't afraid. She made her way back to the cabin as the sun began to rise. Pink light poured through the pines like honey over the ridges, softening everything. For the first time in months, the forest didn't feel like it was keeping secrets. It felt like it had just let her in. Inside, she poured coffee, sat in the rocker, and stared at the fireplace until the logs whispered down into glowing coals. A few minutes passed. Then she spoke aloud. Not to herself, not to the cabin, but to whatever might still be listening. "You can rest now." And in that moment, she realized something that caught her breath in her chest. The knocking had never been meant to frighten her. It had been an invitation. To remember. To finish what Eleanor had started. Because some stories are not told, they are lived, and the forest, for all its silence, had never stopped speaking. We had just forgotten how to listen. Charlotte stayed through the winter. She rebuilt the porch, repaired the old well pump, kept a journal of everything. The wind patterns, the prints, the dreams that now came nightly. And each night, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced against the walls, she would hum, low and steady. And sometimes, just sometimes, she'd hear it echo back. Not loud, not near, but there, and somewhere in the dark, between the bark and the breath, they walked. Still. And now she was one of them. Not in body, but in story. And stories, they never truly disappear. They just wait for someone to return and listen. Some stories aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be felt. Not everything in this world demands proof, and not every truth belongs under a microscope. There are things that live in the quiet, between the wind in the trees and the hush of untouched places. Things that survive not through force, but through memory, through care, through presence. We live in a world that moves fast, one that often forgets the slow language of silence, of reverence. But deep in the forgotten corners of the earth, in places left unpaved and unspoken for, the old rhythms still breathe. Some stories wait, not to be discovered, but to be remembered. They are passed down, not as headlines or footnotes, but in whispers, in porch light stories, in the soft hum of someone still holding on to wonder. The unknown isn't always something to fear. Sometimes, it's a reminder of humility, of how small we are beside the trees that have stood for centuries, of how much we don't understand, and maybe aren't supposed to. In a time when everything demands explanation, there's something profoundly human in choosing, just once, to believe. Not blindly, but with heart, with respect, with openness. Maybe the lesson isn't about monsters or myths at all. Maybe it's about how we see each other, how we care for what we don't fully understand, how we choose to listen when there's no voice shouting back. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary things don't ask to be found. They ask to be trusted. And maybe that's enough. If this story touched something in you, some quiet part that remembers wonder or longs for the kind of mystery that doesn't need solving, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know if you've ever felt watched by something unseen, or if you've heard your own forest whisper. Don't forget to subscribe and follow for more stories like this. Tales that breathe, that ache, that echo long after the last word is spoken. Thank you for walking with us through the trees.